Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 151. I'm really excited for today's guest, not just because he's a brilliant guy, but also because it's a throwback to my graduate school days at the University of Connecticut. He was actually a PhD student while I was a master's student. Learned a lot from him then, and in this show today, we're actually going to learn a lot from him now as well. What's really cool is he has gone from the research realm, actually has a lot of published studies, and was an investigator that looked into a ton of really important complex that favorably impacted the body of knowledge. And now he's really a practicing strength and conditioning coach, person in the sports science world who works directly with athletes on a daily basis in the mixed martial arts community for the UFC. So doing some really cool stuff, and really enjoyed kind of his, not just his thought process with respect to how he interacts with athletes, but how he scales those interactions over a number of different coaches on different continents. So really cool material, and I hope you'll enjoy it as well. This episode is brought to you by Athletic Greens, the most comprehensive NSF certified for sport daily nutritional supplement I've ever tried. With so many stressors in life, it's difficult to maintain effective nutritional habits and give our bodies the nutrients they need to thrive. As a father of 3 young kids and a co-founder of multiple businesses in multiple states, on top of still being an avid exerciser, I know that busy schedules can really take their toll on us. Whether it's poor sleep, exercise or life stressors, environmental factors, or simply not eating enough of the right foods, we can wind up deficient nutritionally. This is where Athletic Greens can really help. It's a game-changing nutritional insurance policy. They simplify the logistics of getting optimal nutrition on a daily basis by giving you just one thing with all the best things. And that's why I use it daily and recommend it to our athletes. 1 scoop of Athletic Greens contains 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients, including a multivitamin, multimineral, probiotic, green superfood blend, and more. They work together to fill the nutritional gaps in your diet, increase energy and focus, aid in digestion, recovery, and supporting of a healthy immune system. This all can happen without taking multiple products. While most nutritional products come to market and stay stagnant, Athletic Greens continues to obsessively improve this one holistic formula based on the latest research, producing 53 improvements over the last decade. They invest in the most absorbable and natural source of each ingredient and go above and beyond in third-party testing to ensure their customers continue to receive the highest quality and best daily nutritional habit on the planet. It's lifestyle friendly, whether you're keto, paleo, vegan, dairy-free, or gluten-free, and contains less than 1 gram of sugar without compromising on taste. They put 75 ingredients through the NSF for Sport certification to come up with a formula that's trusted by some of the world's best athletes, including our own. Right now, Athletic Greens is giving our listeners 10 free travel packets with their subscription. Simply go to athleticgreens.com/Cressey to receive my offer. These travel packs are perfect for supporting your immune system, energy, and gut health when you're traveling for games, training, or simply when you're on the go. They can be a great counterbalance to less than ideal on-the-road food options. So if you want to bridge the gap between deficient and optimal and give yourself the best chance to get nutrient diversity, then head to athleticgreens.com/Cressey and get your 10 free travel packets today. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Cressey, Cressey. Today's guest has served as Vice President of Performance at the UFC Performance Institute in Las Vegas since 2017. Previously, he served as Director of Performance Sciences at the University of Notre Dame. Before Notre Dame, he spent 9 years total over 2 stints as the Senior Strength and Conditioning Coach for the English Institute of Sport and 2 years as Head of Strength and Conditioning for Newcastle United Football Club. He gained his PhD in exercise physiology from the University of Connecticut and authored or co-authored over 50 peer-reviewed scientific manuscripts. He served on the editorial board for the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research and the International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance. He's a fully accredited strength and conditioning coach with the UKSCA, the ASCA, and the NSCA, and he holds a USA weightlifting certification. Please welcome to the show, Dr. Duncan French. Duncan, thanks so much for doing this. It has been way too long.
Oh, good, Eric. Good to see you, man. Good to see you.
And we're getting the Yukon band back together, and
Right.
I got to start with a story. So your resume itself speaks for everything, right? And that's above all else the reason you're on here. But what people don't know, so I was one of 3 grad students accepted at the University of Connecticut in the summer of 2003. And what I never knew about grad school was that master's students and PhD students got lumped together in classes. It makes sense. It's just scale, right? You're not going to run a class for 3 people. But one of my first classes, it was with Dr. Van Heest, and it was exercise endocrinology. And I'll never forget, she did a 2.5-hour lecture on, it was hormone receptor interaction. And I had no idea what the hell she was talking about. I was completely lost. And we were looking around the room, and I mean, the PhD students in that class have done some awesome things. A lot of them are in academia. Barry's working at New Balance, and I just remember at the end of the class, I don't even know if you remember saying this. You pulled me aside, and you're like, "Yeah, I missed a lot of that too," and it was super helpful for me because she was brilliant, and I was just like, "Oh my gosh, I'm a fish out of water." So I appreciate those kind words in a moment when I really needed them.
It's all good. My story is a little bit different because I always people say your name comes up in passing, and they say, "Oh, Eric Cressey, and he's doing great things." Like I was like, "Oh, Eric Cressey, that guy. He was my little spotty master student assistant for all of my data collection."
Yep, I was running around. We were training study subjects, and as I recall, we had a really underwhelming intramural basketball team too. So
There you go. There we
that's
go.
right.
All
Well,
right.
good.
We're
We've
going back.
all gone on to great things. But hey, man, your resume has already been shared. But I think a good place to start with, like you're front and center with a lot of really cool initiatives that UFC is rolling out. Maybe speak a little bit to what your role is, what it encompasses. Who you kind of supervise in your role, as well as what kind of athletes you're dealing with.
Yeah, so I'm the vice president of performance for the UFC Performance Institute. In a nutshell, the PI, as we call it, is the high performance service arm for all the athletes on the UFC roster. So we have about 650 fighters on the UFC.
Wow.
They're all decentralized, very much so, around the globe. About 54% of that roster are based in the US. Brazilians that live in Miami or whatever it may be, a big Latin community down there. But it's truly a global kind of network. So the Performance Institute provides the service support for those guys and girls. So we have kind of strength and conditioning, sports science, nutrition, sports medicine, psychology, sports science, kind of opportunities for the athletes to tap into those services as and when they choose to. It's very a la carte in fashion. We support 43 events around the globe for event support. The guys that are on the fights on a Saturday evening. And yeah, we've got our kind of HQ here in Las Vegas, the mothership, let's say. But we've got a sister facility in Shanghai, China, where I've actually got a full-time academy with 27 athletes that we're trying to break into the UFC. And in September this year, we're going to open another academy in Mexico City as well. So territorially, the Performance Institute is starting to go more global because, again, we need the global reach of the infrastructure. It can't all be done via Las Vegas. So yeah, it's pretty cool trip that I'm on right now. Very humbled to be in this position. I'm around some great people and been able to recruit a great team from day one. And yeah, we think we're moving the needle for the sport of mixed martial arts.
That's very cool. And honestly, I never realized how expansive the reach was. And as you started to describe it, it's literally the only other time I've probably talked with a professional in this field that it kind of appreciates what we deal with minor league baseball.
Right,
Like you go to the NBA, you go to the NFL, you're in the league in year one. They're really, there's a minor league in the NBA to some degree. There really isn't so much in the NFL anymore. But in baseball, we have 90 guys at least at a Dominican academy. There's many levels of minor league stuff, and you are seeing teams get more international in a lot of ways there. So I didn't realize the UFC had kind of spread their wings so much. That's very, very cool. What are the most, I guess, challenging parts of that? Because obviously there's a lot of scale involved, right? It's not just being progressive. We know you're progressive and you're a nerd like I am, reading research and getting in the trenches and experimenting with things. But you got to understand managing systems. You got to understand leading people, and then more importantly, how to scale it across multiple continents. Like what in your day to day is the hardest challenge of kind of accomplishing those ends?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up some great points right there. But I mean, listen, the cross we bear is geography, right? I mean, ultimately, we're truly working in a decentralized system, and it's really challenging doing remote work and keeping continuity of care with an athlete that you spend, I don't know, a month with here in Las Vegas, and they go back to Russia or they go back to Poland or they go back to China or whatever it may be. And it's like, how do we kind of continue that interaction, that interface to be influential and supportive with what we're trying to do? So geography is our biggest challenge. There's lots of layers to our operation. It's pretty complex in nature. And the other thing which I always talk to is like the bespoke nature of it. We don't have custom system. Excuse me. We don't have pre-packaged systems. Everything we do is custom and bespoke.
Yeah.
So again, a lot of effort goes into that to, number one, understand the needs of the athlete, and then understand how we have to pivot and flex our system to accommodate and optimize. And that's what we really, that's what the mantra that I try and adopt with the whole team is. We should be going down the rabbit hole with the individual. This is an individual sport. It's not necessarily a team sport. It's an individual sport. So everyone's got different needs and requirements at different moments in time. And our system has to be able to accommodate that and optimize the experience for the athlete client at that moment in time. So, there's a lot of complexity to our operation, and I think that's the challenge from being in the clubhouse at a team or whatever, where everyone's going to report at 9 a.m. in the morning. Everyone's going to be on the field at a particular time or on the court. Everyone's got to hit the weight room at this time. Everyone's going to be in therapy at this time. We don't have that liberty, so it's very it's very diverse in terms of what we're talking about across our team at any moment in time, and how we're trying to solve these performance problems with the athletes.
It's fascinating to me, and before we maybe get to like more the nuts and bolts of more granular athlete preparation, I'm actually really curious about your path, because we obviously spent some time together at the University of Connecticut, and you were all in on research then. In fact, my grad assistantship was funded by a study from the U.S. Army that you were one of the lead investigators on.
Right.
And I was one of the minions running around, and you were the one bringing the brain power to the operation. But I'm curious, after you left UConn, you ultimately came back to coaching. Obviously, you went back English Institute for Sport, Newcastle, and eventually Notre Dame, and now to where you are now. What was it that drew you back to performance, that realm after being in academia? Was it that you always intended to use the PhD as an avenue to do that, or is it just something that you love the athlete interaction?
Yeah, I mean, all of the above, but I think you nailed it with the last point. I mean, ultimately, the athlete interaction. I try to epitomize the true definition of an applied practitioner, applied scientist. Whilst I've done my PhD and it was a great experience, and I was around some great people like yourself and others, that still very close with. My passion was never really in writing and publishing manuscripts that would sit on a shelf and would inform others. I'm very keen on pursuing the championship, pursuing the gold medal myself. I want to be chasing the gold medals like the athlete does. And I always felt I was kind of one layer removed from that in a pseudo-academic laboratory setting, and not really at the coalface changing those finite decisions that affect performance on a day-to-day basis. Of course, we all draw on the body of research and the body of literature every day to make ourselves, be progressive and better at what we do. So I'm not downplaying the value of it, but just my motives and my values were more aligned to, all right, I want to be in the spit and the sawdust at the coalface, really applying scientific theories and approaches in a day-to-day setting where we can challenge some of these things we've been told in the literature. So it was just more of a motivation to be around, the applied setting rather than in a truly scientific or an academic kind of vein.
Yeah, and then once you get into the performance realm, before you know it, you have 800 studies that you'd love to run every week just on questions you have. So it kind of feeds your curiosity at the wrong point in your career, I guess, right?
Yeah.
So one of the themes of some of the podcasts that we're doing lately, we actually had Lauren Landau on just this past week, and I'm a big believer in look outside of baseball to learn more about baseball. We've had people from the golf world, people from the tennis community, all different things that have really impacted our work at CSP. And I'm curious, when you look at your realm of expertise, MMA, and you also have done basketball, you've done soccer. What are the big lessons that you think baseball athletes can learn from those other disciplines, whether it's MMA or some of the other things that you've encountered? What's universal across all disciplines?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I've actually been invited to speak at the NFL Combine this year, and I've spoke at Major League Baseball winter meetings and NHL summer meetings and things. So yeah, I mean, I'm a huge advocate of that. I think it's imperative that we learn from others, and 100% agree that like sport can be myopic at times. And it's very reductionist in nature. So we become more and more focused on the granular detail that's straight in front of us within our sport or our team unit or with the athlete that we're working with or within the position group that we're working with, whatever it may be. I know in your world, you're drilling down on pitching mechanics and you're drilling down on, sprint to first and all this type of stuff. It's just becomes more and more focused and focused and focused. And sometimes I just think, pulling it back and just going down a completely different avenue can be such a refreshing approach, to the development. And I think, that's really important. I try to do that personally, and draw from others' experiences. But I mean, I think, being around mixed martial artists, so I've had the pleasure of working with over 40 different professional or Olympic teams in my career, all very diverse in nature, whether that's basketball or soccer or swimming, gymnastics, rugby, whatever it is, and now mixed martial arts. I think MMA is probably the most kind of challenging sport I've been around. So many degrees of freedom in this sport. There's so many, whether it's the fight styles that an athlete comes with. We've got 11 different weight classes, all with different kind of determinants of success. There's just lots of variability in this sport by its nature. You can the law of equifinality is maximized in this sport because you can get to success through so many different ways of competing. But I think what's at the core of everything is, our best guys, the elite guys, have a commitment to drilling the fundamentals, the repetition of ensuring, it's that old adage, amateurs do it till they can't get it, till they get it right, and pros do it till they can't get it wrong, right? That's truly the case. And the best guys are constantly working on, skill acquisition, getting back on the mats, combating the fatigue, recovering effectively so that when they come back tomorrow, their level of skill acquisition is always maintained, whereas everybody else kind of falls off for 2 or 3 days and then they'll rebound. So, the skill acquisition piece is suboptimal, let's say. And just watching these guys drill and do that, I mean, jiu-jitsu as a style. I mean, you think of all the different body positions and postures you can be in jiu-jitsu and try to, be an offensive fighter or a defensive fighter out of those positions. It's just infinite. So, drilling all those scenarios, doing that fundamentally over and over again, rehearsing those, is really impressive. And then just the mental fortitude, right? I work with warriors on a day-to-day basis. I work with fighters and the true epitome of fight or flight. So, the embracing of the grind, the dedication to, just getting through those dark days and those challenging days. But, the mental fortitude of this population is amazing. Again, having worked with basketball players or soccer players, and I'm not downplaying that, but it's just a different mentality. It's just a different athlete.
Yeah, I think the art of being able to flip the switch and compete for a lot of athletes, it has to be nurtured over a really long time. I feel like to some degree it's almost assumed if you're getting into something as dangerous as MMA, one thing goes wrong, you can be in a really, really bad place. So
definitely some consequences.
Yeah, it is. That's huge. But as you were describing just the degrees of freedom, I was kind of jealous in the sense that our athletes do the same thing over and over. It's a sport of pattern overload. Do you see less of your chronic tendinopathies, these things that we tend to see with people who are just stuck in rigid patterns? Obviously, you see more trauma, you see more, acute injuries when, guys get in funky positions that they're not expecting. But do you feel like you see less of the patellar tendinopathies, the Achilles things that you otherwise would in your basketball, your soccer backgrounds because of it?
Yeah. Well, what I would say, first of all, is it's kind of a double-edged sword because there's lots of training components that these guys need to consider and address, right? So you can't just wrestle. You've got to wrestle against the cage. You've got to wrestle on the ground. You've got to do jiu-jitsu. You've got to do submissions. You've got to do defensive grappling. You've got to do striking. You've got to be kickboxers. So all these different technical units have to go into your training week. And that is a big challenge for our guys because, it's like the decathlon. Where are you putting all the separate components and still allowing yourself the opportunity to recover and regenerate? That's one of the biggest challenges we have. But yeah, we see some chronic position. I mean, obviously combat fighters usually are in the guard, so they're very internally rotated in this bladed position. We see a lot of neck and upper back and scap chronic patterns. But then if we look at our injury surveillance stuff, a lot of the issues in training are quite traumatic, related to scrambles, like wrestling scrambles.
Yeah.
So then you're talking knees and shoulders, people getting rolled up on in a practice or whatever it may be. So we see a lot of joint issues that are very,
Yeah.
mechanistically like related to just the way that they're fighting and
Yeah.
training. It's not a repetition pattern as you would see with a pitcher's shoulder. And again, I don't
Yeah.
want to talk about that. That's not my expertise, but we do see some chronic patterns with respect to neck and upper back, and some hip labral issues, a lot of hip and shoulder labral issues, just because of throwing the limbs, and what that does. And that's kind of the main chronic stuff that we see. Most of the other stuff is pretty traumatic in nature.
I mean, I love the idea of having to prepare people for a wide variety of stimuli, right? And in
Yeah,
baseball, we've seen great outcomes just adding amplitude to guys' daily lives, right? Instead of like doing 25-minute long distance run the day after a start, like go through a
yeah,
mobility circuit, throw the med ball, do some easy change of direction, just something to expose you to a different stimuli that a lot of people just don't get in the younger ages when they're specializing early and all that. Are most of your athletes guys that got into mixed martial arts young? Were they former like football players, hockey players, people like that who converted later and discovered it, or is it kind of a mixed bag?
it's a real mixed bag. And again, it's another layer to that degree of freedom, right? We've got weight classes, but within the
Yeah,
weight class, you can have a short, stocky wrestler, and you can have a
yeah,
long, tall, skinny kickboxer. We've had people that have won NC2A national championships in football, and have decided to then move into fighting and combat. We've had Olympic wrestlers. We get guys that are fighting in smoker series in local bars, and just going through people and aggregating the win column, and then people sit and go, oh, this guy looks like he's got a hard head, let's get him in the UFC. There isn't really a natural pathway, a really defined pathway. What I would say is that in this day and age, more and more younger people are starting with MMA as a core foundation. So MMA gyms, right? Whereas historically, you came with a wrestling background or you came with
yeah,
a boxing background, you had a stylistic preference, which still does happen, but you're seeing way more generalists just training mixed martial arts from the get-go. So they're learning all of these constituent styles at the same time of development. It's not like we're going to take your striking and we're just going to, like, your striking becomes world class and then we'll try and catch up with your jiu-jitsu and your wrestling. It's kind of moving together. And we see that a lot more with younger people coming into the sport.
right on. Now you obviously have background, preparing for Olympic training cycles. Certainly, like in MMA, guys are prepping for large events over an extended period of time. So it got me thinking just a little bit about like the concept of recovery across multiple time intervals. So, you have athletes that, certainly like they spar for a little bit and they take a break and they come back, something that would be analogous to, even what we do in the weight room, what our pitchers deal with between pitches. And this is kind of a hot topic just because the pitch clock is being shortened in Major League Baseball this year.
Right.
Everybody's kind of curious what the impact it'll be was. So you have to, recover between rounds, during halftime in certain sports. There are longer ones where it's, a training session on a Monday, you got to come back Tuesday and do it again. And then there's the lengthier periods after a big competition, before you begin your next training block. With the short-term stuff, right? What are you seeing as like key recovery competencies for your athletes that you feel like, generally bounce back well, both in the session and then maybe overnight? Are there certain things that you really hammer home with your athletes?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Listen, there's certain time frames where you just got to be super targeted, and it might just be a mental reset. Do you know what I mean? We have a minute between rounds. There's not a lot that somebody can do in that space of time. So really, it's about a mindset shift and regrounding an athlete and making them present, because usually they're either living in what's just happened in the round previously and why didn't I get this position, or they might have just been through a pretty atrocious war and it's like, right, I'm going into the next round, what's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
So grounding them, making them present. Our psychologists work a lot on that. I always talk about refuel, rehydrate, remove if you can. So any type of removal of the byproducts of the exercise, if you can do some quick flushing type activities and there's time frame to do that between sets or whatever, rebalance the system and then reset the mind, kind of the 5 hours that I talk to. Some of those obviously are very small periods of time. Others might take a bit longer. But I think that they're the key things that I always and that we always work to with our athletes. Now beyond that, then you can really start to look at, all right, the regulating the power of the down state, really starting to understand sympathetic drive and sympathetic arousal versus the parasympathetic relaxation state. I spoke to Sarah Mednick from Cal State Irvine a lot on this. She's got a book on that, and she's got some interesting ideas. She's a professor of psychology, but looking at physiological and psychological regulation of the down state, being able to really bring things back down, and then again you're expediting the recovery time. Then you're giving yourself a longer runway prior to going back into either tomorrow or into the next phase of training. I think what I would say is that we have the same issue. We have within a wrestling practice, which is again fight or flight. Guys are going and fighting on the mats. They might do eight sparring rounds, and then they might get 2 minutes rest, and then they're into some kind of drilling like that. That kind of complete flip. We've got to refuel them. We've got to ensure that the return on the energy levels is there, and that's just the nutrient timing conversation. Then we've got kind of just a sustained effort across time. And then we've got things like, well, people have a fight and they take 3 weeks off, what we're doing during that 3 weeks. But, we need them to have some downtime, but we need them to, get back on the horse if they can around the parameters of injury and those types of things. But, it's different for every guy. And because, as I say, there's a sport of consequences. So people usually start from different levels, and you've got to get them back to a habitual baseline.
That's something that's near and dear to me, like the concept of rested versus ready. I think, Major League Baseball, the regular season ends, first couple of days in October, and, they report, in mid-February, and we're right about at that. And, the challenge is you see these guys who just like don't do anything for a month. They kind of go off the grid, and it's tough because that's the lowest hanging fruit. It's like it's the chance to normalize sleep patterns, nutrition patterns. If something's broken, to get it fixed. You're trying to learn stuff, and you just see so many guys that get surprised when December rolls around and they start moving a little bit more, and things just aren't where they need to be. And it's such a short off season, particularly if players go to the postseason and play longer. We're seeing even more so this year with the World Baseball Classic.
Right.
It always seems to get squeezed. So I feel like so many of these guys, think they're feeling great, and then they actually start moving around, and they're really not at all close to prepared in the off season. Or the season sneaks up on them. Yeah. And this is a really, overarching general concept. When guys have, a big competition in your world, is there kind of a accepted, like, take this much time off? Because obviously there's trauma, there's more to bounce back from. It's, it's a lot different than just going out and throwing 110 pitches in the last game of the season. Yeah. Do you see like a certain range when guys just don't do anything versus like come back and start with light stuff? Do you have guys that are back in the gym the next morning just because they feel like they need to, and that's how they recover best?
Yeah, I mean, I think, trauma management is obviously the first thing after a fight, after competition, right? So that's obviously got different levels of severity, and you got to make sure someone's return to play, appropriate. So we got to remove the kind of, the consequences of the trauma. But yeah, we ultimately then want people to have some amount of downtime. Usually they've gone through a pretty intensive 8 to 10 week fight camp, and I'm really getting into kind of reading up and my thoughts around overreaching and non-functional overreaching, because I do think in this population it's a little bit endemic, because it's 8 weeks, this competition phase, and historically it's always been, right, you get booked for a fight, now I've got 8 weeks to get everything in that 8 week period to then go and compete. And I always say, it shouldn't be an 8 week fight camp. It should be a 52 week fight camp. We've got to start adopting this philosophy of longitudinal and annual phasing. And usually our guys will have anywhere between 2 to 4 fights. 3 is normal. 4 is it starts getting a lot in a year. So, you can do the math in terms of the amount of weeks. If they keep getting booked, because this is a professional promotion, the fans want to see certain people. Okay, well, we'll get you rebooked. Okay. Then you start condensing your general preparatory phases, where you can be a bit more progressive in the development and the acquisition of certain attributes, and you then straight back into another competition phase and another competition phase. Now that drives certain issues, because usually in our sport it's coming with a background of caloric restriction as well, because people to make weight. We're a weight class sport. That has certain downstream effects on metabolism and endocrine function and these types of things. And then just like I say, the sympathetic drive that goes into an 8-week fight camp, preparing every day for 8 weeks for a fist fight. There's a certain amount of adrenal burnout that we need to have some consideration on in that post-fight kind of reset, recycle phase.
I
So
love that.
we like our guys to at least take a week or 2 weeks of just very very minimal things, but then they need to start getting back into some light work, and we can then see what the next kind of target is if we're aware of it or not. And if we don't, then we can drop them into just a more general preparatory type phase, and we can kick it up into specific work or competition work when we've got more clarity on that.
We interrupt this episode with a quick reminder that this podcast is brought to you by Athletic Greens. It's an NSF certified all-in-one superfood supplement with 75 whole food sourced ingredients designed to support your body's nutritional needs. I use this product daily, and a ton of our athletes do as well. Head to athleticgreens.com/Cressey and claim my special offer today for 10 free travel packs with your first purchase. I'd encourage you to give it a shot too, especially because of this great offer and because it gives you peace of mind knowing that you're covering all your nutritional bases. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Cressey, Cressey, to get that special offer. You just use the word target, and I think that's maybe a good segue to my next question. In the baseball world, like things are exponentially different, compared to what they were 20 years ago. Everything from how players are evaluated with the increased focus on data, and certainly how the game is played. It's much more specialized with, relievers, basically seeing certain guys throwing 98-mile cutters out of the bullpen, starter pitchers not going as long, just everything has changed. So I'm curious, and certainly the injuries have evolved as well. How has MMA evolved? Like obviously it's a newer sport in maybe the organizational sense, even though, folks have been doing this for a long, long time. How has it evolved? And do you see it evolving more in different ways, both in terms of how you evaluate athletes and also how you prepare them and what's expected of them?
Yeah, it's a great point, right? And I think that's kind of why the Performance Institute was built, to try and help the evolution of the sport. It's part of our mission statement to accelerate the evolution of mixed martial arts, to push it to new higher levels all the time. But mixed martial arts, by its nature, is a sport of innovation, right? People are figuring out, as we've kind of talked to Eric, like the fighters are always trying new techniques and figuring out new ways. Can I throw this punch from this position or in this scenario? Can I counter in this posture? If I'm on the ground, what happens if I go with this, rolling this way rather than the other way? That they're always innovating and playing around with it. So it's a sport of innovation, which really kind of continues to advance the sport. We've seen some very apparent advances. The use of low leg kicks now has become very mainstream in our sport, where historically it wasn't always something that was there. So that's a very debilitating weapon that people now use as part of their arsenal. Because we've got 8 weapons: hands, elbows, knees, feet. So just looking at those things that's kind of like the 3-point shot in basketball. It's now lower leg kicks are like, wow, everyone's now throwing low leg kicks because of what it can do. So yeah, there's definitely evolution. Some of those are technically orientated. Some of the conditioning obviously is just elevated. When you look at the top guys, the level of conditioning is just phenomenal. And we're also, like you say, a sport that's pretty young in nature. It's our 30th anniversary of the UFC this year. So the sport technically was, professionalized in 1993. So data and analytics obviously runs throughout your sport, right? Because of the situational nature of baseball. But certainly looking at data analysis, video analysis, and those types of things is becoming more apparent in fighting as well. And yeah, listen, the brain health piece is, I'm a huge believer. Like we kind of know how to make people strong, right? We kind of know how to make people fast and more explosive. But the next frontier in just human optimization is the brain, right? And when we look at brain health in fighters and combat athletes and how we, ensure cognition is optimized against the backdrop of being hit in the head and what that's trying, what your opponent is trying to do. Certainly that's something we're trying to advance the narrative of and get more kind of awareness of.
That's important stuff. You mentioned just kind of like the superior conditioning, and obviously conditioning is kind of a broad term, but
Mm,
one of the things I'm actually intrigued about is we talk a lot with our athletes about, strength and aerobic capacity seem to stick around really, really well. It
yeah.
seems to be that power detrains the fastest. And, so certainly with our, our older athletes in particular, like the longer they take off, the more that seems to fall off. I
Yeah.
actually done some interesting studies just on athletes who have, had upper extremity surgeries, and it's blown my mind how quickly, some of their force plate numbers have fallen off just in the time, like waiting for an elbow surgery, the limited, activity level, in the short term, just because you can't do a lot of explosive stuff while you're in a brace, and
Mm.
it takes time to get that back. Do you see that trend? Does the conditioning stick around for your guys at a high level? Is there a certain quality that you feel like in your world detrains the fastest? Because you're dealing with higher standards, right? Like these
Yeah.
guys need to be conditioned, or they're going to get beaten up.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've never heard anyone come out the octagon and say, "Oh man, I wasn't strong enough." But
Yeah,
I've heard lots of people come out and say, "I wasn't conditioned where I
yeah,
needed to be, and that's why I lost the fight." So, yeah, bioenergetics is a massive piece of combat and mixed martial arts. Um, I think as a differentiator, glycolytic physiology. So, the ability to tolerate high lactate loads and high hydrogen ion content in the body, just acidosis. Because again, like when you're looking at the repeat grappling efforts or wrestling efforts, if you're throwing multiple combinations of strikes, that's just dry. It's all done with intent at high intensity, right? So, and unlike a pitcher, there isn't that 20, 30-second recovery. It's go, 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 right? So,
yeah.
I think the best guys have very, very high glycolytic capabilities, and that detrains pretty quickly, right? So if throughout a fight camp, we can see people get to a very advanced level, and then when they've competed and come back into our system, might do some diagnostics or whatever it may be. Certainly, that buffering capacity is lost pretty quickly,
Interesting.
just because the exposure is not there. It's interesting because we're doing a lot of work at the minute with NIRS, looking at peripheral oxygenation in the arms and the legs. And we're seeing some really interesting things where we actually think we're looking, so like loaded sled tests or air bike 6-second efforts, explosive power efforts. Um, it's really interesting because we're using those as like the alactic or glycolytic assessments. But what we're seeing, we also wear a mask using a metabolic cart, and we're seeing like the VO2 scores are going up to like 95% of a VO2
Wow.
max, around 62 milliliters per kg per minute. Like so, even on these highly explosive efforts, there's some really unique physiology going on the aerobic side that's supporting the process. And again,
Wow.
going back to school, right? It's like
Yeah.
these energy systems don't sit in isolation.
Yeah.
We can really drive an aerobic demand even through pretty explosive stuff as well, reinforcing the recoverability need for our sport, which comes in line with that glycolytic effort as well. So that's kind of where all the bioenergetics sits as an importance for our sport.
That's huge. And when we were at UConn, you were involved in a lot of cool stuff, right? There were blood draws, there were muscle biopsies, and I'm curious, like, what you hinted at just a little bit with the metabolic cart conversation, but what are some of the key physiological variables that you guys are looking at in your higher level athletes? And and selfishly, I'm particularly curious is are you looking closely at blood work with your athletes? Like if you had a high level guy that's coming to you and you want to do a blood panel on him, what are the big things that you're digging on that would be universal to all athletes?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think what I would say is that we've got a pretty comprehensive diagnostic portfolio. Some of those are kind of tier one diagnostics and tier two diagnostics. So some are more fundamental in nature, and some are more detailed or more specific to the individual. We do use blood work on a pretty regular basis. Obviously, as a phlebotomist and a biochemist through my grad studies, it's something that I've been interested in. We don't do it with everybody. That's largely because of the financial impact of 650 fighters. Like
Yeah.
it's just a big budget to do that. So what we tend to do is we will use some of our tier one metabolic assessments
Mhm.
to essentially go through the checklist. All right, is there anything that's out of whack here? Is there a suppressed energy level or a reduced RMR or something that might demonstrate physiological suppression?
Mhm.
And if we start to think, okay, well, some of these tier one tests are just not showing what we thought they would do, we'll go into a deeper dive, and then I can be much more targeted with an individual where we'll go into the biochemistry and the blood work, and then we can start looking at hormonal profiles, particularly in the ladies. That's a big thing because of female physiology and the lack of energy availability when they're cutting to make weight and restricting their diet. That really disrupts female function. Iron status is obviously a huge one. We'll look at some CRP and some stress hormones, cortisol, and some immunology markers. So it's everything from complete blood count profiles through to iron status and metabolism and thyroid and those types of things. But it's a very easy way to answer the question. But we really take it on an individual basis. And that's where you're drawing on the expertise of our team members with the dietitians and the sports scientists and the strength coaches, all putting their thoughts forth to say, okay, well, looking within my domain, I think it might be this. And then we can go after certain targeted assessments then.
And I think sometimes you go down the rabbit hole when there's something that doesn't make sense, right? You get the chronically injured or fatigued athlete or something to that effect where it warrants the deeper dive for sure after you've done the initial kind of entry level stuff.
And we do some stuff on food allergies as well, and gut health, which again, as you can imagine, in athletes that are making weight, and where diet is such a huge parameter, not just for fueling and building, but also like about body composition to make weight and what an athlete exposes their gut to. We do a fair bit of assessment with some individuals around that space as well. So, I spoke to Mike Potenza about this, who used to be at the LA at the Sharks and the NHL, and now he's with where did he go? He's with basketball now. He's with Golden State Warriors. And he had a really great portfolio of biochemistry. I just don't have the capacity to do that in that much detail with every single one of my fighters that comes through the Performance Institute. So it's more in a very specific, targeted approach.
I love that. Maybe building on some of the assessment stuff. Maybe let's talk about program design and coaching. This is the hardest thing to teach. I mean, you've mentored a ton of young coaches. There's no recipe book to learn how to write strength and conditioning programs, but particularly with what you described, right?
Yeah.
A collection of crazy different movements, obviously multiple continents, multiple languages, different fighting styles, all these things. What are the big rocks? What are the things that, when it comes to program design and coaching, what elements do you think are key considerations in just about any, program that you would need to write, whether it's for your basketball guys over the years, soccer, or obviously MMA?
Yeah, well, in jest, I always say there is a perfect training program, but it's just different for everybody.
Yeah,
and I think that's at the heart of my philosophy. Whenever I do a presentation, I show a slide, from Malcolm Tucker that basically shows 6 athletes and their genetic potential, and then the impact of training on that genetic potential, and how close we as support staff can get them close to filling the bucket, like filling the genetic bucket. And I think that's our job. So, that's different for everybody. Everyone's got a different size bucket that they're trying to fill. So when it comes to program design, it cannot be a one size fits all. You will know, you put your 25 guys on your squad through the same field-based workout, it's 25 different responses to the same workout, right? So I think from the get-go, I try to promote that. I try to get us all to think, yes, it's tough when you're working with teams because it's an efficiency and it's a time issue. But there needs to be some consideration around how you start to not individualize, but how you target certain adaptations. So I'm a huge believer in adaptation-led programming. So it's not necessarily about the exercises or the methodologies that you use or adopt. It's about the adaptations that are consequential to any intervention. For me, weak things break, strong things don't. So be robust and ready. So there is an emphasis on strength for not only longevity, career, and injury prevention, or let's say minimization, because we're not preventing injuries, but minimization and mitigation. Something you touched on earlier, movement vocabulary. I want to give somebody the biggest encyclopedia of athletic skills that I possibly can, regardless of the sport. You need a movement vocabulary, and then whatever you sport, you can take, chapters 4, 5, and 7 and use those for your sport. But if you restrict movement vocabulary and skill set, that's a limitation. And things like midline core strength, mobility, they're big rocks. But I'm also a believer in you have to earn the right for your program to become more complex.
Yes.
So when you're looking at accentuated eccentrics or chains or flywheels or whatever it may be, all these cool tools that we have at our disposal, you can't jump on those unless you've essentially earned the right to adopt that more complex approach to the physical insult.
I always say strength buys you a seat at the table.
Yep.
Having that foundation, and you even talked about it, weak things break, strong things don't. Strength is the foundation for joint stability. It's the foundation for power development. It really creates the floor for just about everything. Like, do you actually see athletes at that level that show up fundamentally weak? In order to be in that, 600, 100, whatever athletes, is there a foundation level of strength that doesn't matter? The reason I ask this is we've done some cool testing with Proteus with a lot of athletes, and they've rolled that out across the country. And it's fascinating to see how increased athleticism as measured by power, which obviously is a derivative of strength, it makes a big difference from high school to college. But if you actually look at the power numbers for college and professional athletes, they're actually it's almost a flat line. It's like skill takes you to the next level. Strength and conditioning becomes very, supportive. It's there just to make sure that you can go in and get the skill work you need in order to develop an elite slider or to continue advancing in your mechanics to the point that you can get on an aggressive throwing program and get more skill specific adaptations. Do you see that in MMA as well, where there's a level of strength that gets you to that point and then additional probably doesn't take you further?
Yeah, I think we see it all. I mean, we've got people that won't touch a weight. All their resistance work is coming from sport specific training. So if you're a stand up boxer or a stand up kickboxer, that you're not really taking on much load. There's this old school dogma around lifting weights makes you slow and all this type of stuff. We're still battling all those types of things. Then you have the opposite where we've got our collegiate wrestlers or Olympic wrestlers, and they're pushing 4.5, 5 times their own body weight, and really producing pretty significant over 50 newtons per kg of muscle, kg of body weight. I have to do the conversion because I'm not in pounds right now, but that's pretty substantial. So we do see it all. And usually that's again, it's the dogma of training history in combat sports. If people have come through NC2A programs, usually they've been exposed to good strength training. But if people have come through local gyms on the local fight scene, they might just not be versed with that type of approach. So again, same thing. As long as you have range, and end range strength for us, as with you, is a big thing because of the submissions and the joint locks, and the ability to tolerate end range force application. We see the benefit of incremental, force, expression and absorption in mitigating and reducing injury characteristics for sure, or at least the magnitude of a trauma.
We have to almost reclassify what strength really is, right? It's not just squatting, it's not just deadlifting, it's how you use it in the positions that matter, particularly in a sport like that where there are a lot of positions that matter. Maybe switching gears a little bit. We touched on it a little bit earlier, but you've been very prolific as a researcher and certainly published a lot. And we both know that's just what's published. There's a lot of stuff that you look at, you learn from, but never actually makes it to a journal. But I'm sure there are also scenarios where you've looked to the research that's come out as you try to apply it in your day-to-day practice. And there are things that you see it's just inferior quality research. It's large inferences from small sample sizes or just poor study designs. Are there big issues that you think, that the people in our world, right, the boots on the ground, training athletes really need to be mindful as we try to take stuff from, the literature to try to help our athletes? Are there big gaps in the research?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's tough, right? Because you and I have we're blessed to be working with the top 5%, right? And that there's not much research that goes into that percentile. So for people like ourselves, you're making insinuations or a leap of faith that a sample population from whatever it may be you can extrapolate it to the physiology of a and the psychology of a world class athlete and the training exposure and the insult that we're placing on the body is it comparable? You know what I mean? So I think that's just an underlying kind of general rule that what is that just the body of awareness in truly elites is probably not that great. I think there's a lot more coming out of the Olympic sports because the Olympic sports just have the liberty of 4 years. So in that first year of a quad, where it's a long way away, you can really start to look at some high powered sports science in truly elites. But in like yourself, where you're going week to week and multiple games in a week, or camps that just come and go so fast, we're not really getting that type of insights. But whether it's supplement claims, whether it's kind of the recovery space is a big narrative at the moment. I truly believe the recovery kind of conversation has to be handled correctly. Again, it's not about the pendulum just saying, well, do less. We have to understand the parameters of why you're trying to recover, because the body of work has been done prior to it. But workload ratios are kind of controversial at the minute. I think in principle, it's a great philosophy, but there's been a lot of debate and interrogation of the algorithms and the statistics behind some of those workload ratios and whether they're truly influential or not. Like I say, I think it's a great concept. I think you just got to take it with caution. You can't put all your eggs in that basket and say, well, this number is saying that athlete X, Y, or Z has to stop and be pulled away. Particularly spoke to a bunch of guys in the NBA where workload management or people being pulled on a workload related factor is becoming a bit of an epidemic in the NBA right now, and a lot of the coaches are very frustrated by it, whereas the Players Association is obviously trying to protect and support its personnel, and it's an interesting narrative is workload at the minute as well.
It's a big discussion in baseball. You're 162 games, maybe 2 days off per month, and it's hard, particularly with the number of cross country flights and things like that take place. Time zone changes. It's a big difference maker, and something we obviously as an industry need to get better at, not just like understanding, but actually documenting, like what belongs in the equation that's being used to drive those decisions. Maybe another shift gears, but you work with athletes all across the training lifespan. Obviously, you see professionals now, people who are doing this for a living. But I know over the years you've interacted with teenagers who are kind of upstart athletes. Are there certain key checkpoints that you think if a 16-year-old kid is listening to this and they want to get to a higher level of athletics, what's on your developmental timeline? And where do things go wrong? Where do they go right in this process?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really work, apart from my son who's 6 years old. I'm the head coach of his U6 soccer team, which is probably the most stressful coaching job I've ever had in my life,
Like herding cats.
Right, totally. It's wild. I don't really work with younger age groups anymore. But yeah, definitely long term development and looking at key markers in that process. I think what I would say is fundamentals last forever. I mean, even at the highest level, you have to establish good fundamental practices, and you have to find out routines and processes that should become career long. If you're a 15, 16-year-old, look at how you can develop good morning routines. How can mobility? How can you get into good sleep patterns, and then upon waking, mobility, and any type of meditation or mind kind of focusing and being present and grounded, through to breath work and then the nutrition piece. These are all fundamental things that make sense to a 15-year veteran, as well as someone that's just 16 to 18-year-old trying to really establish themselves in high school and get into the college ranks, right? So the best athletes in the world are the ones where life is pretty mundane and it's pretty dull, because it looks the same. It always looks the same. And you and I would look at it and go, holy cow, how do you do that every single day? But there is this dedication to the process. I think that's kind of the message I would give to that question.
Fundamentals last forever. I'm completely stealing that. Oh, that's good. All right, so we're up against time crunch here, but I got two more for you, and they kind of piggyback on each other. What's been your biggest growth area over the past year? Like what's changed? What have you adjusted in your approach? With athletes or anything?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think for me, my role right now, there's been a lot of leadership development. I coach athletes, but I coach coaches more so now.
Yeah.
And I think that my development, ongoing development right now, because of the position that I'm in, is more about looking at the integration of things and how things work together. It's not this kind of linear tunnel of strength and power development or speed development or whatever it may be in the strength and conditioning space. It's understanding how can I take a step back, remove my professional bias to that domain and that area, and say what's the value of this dietitian, and when do we need to bring them on board? And this psychologist is saying something which is a strength coach I can't dismiss because it's actually going to help me down the lane. And I think that's kind of where I continue to grow, is just looking at models of holistic optimization, not just looking at, well, how do I optimize from the physical preparation side of things, but looking at all the constituent pieces that can influence the outcome. That's kind of really where I continue to grow and develop.
And that's challenging for two reasons. One, which I actually love, like you have to seek out opportunities to be the dumbest guy in the room.
Yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
that's super important. But the other thing that's tricky about it is you're ultimately expanding the team, and you know that like team dynamics, the success is always in the synergy. So you're not just evaluating their competency; they're evaluating their fit. How well do they work with the other members of the team, their athletes, and it's very easy to just be like, all right, we're going to add 50 people to the team for this one athlete, but before you know it, you can get a lot of people riding 10 horses with one saddle.
Yeah, you got to get people that want to embrace the philosophy of not multidisciplinary services but interdisciplinary service structures, and how these things come together. So that's huge.
Nice. So building on that, I know you're a very progressive guy, always have been, and you're looking for ways to get better. What's the stuff that you think about at 3 a.m. as you stare off into blackness? What gets you excited to learn more? What would you want to study to help you in your day to day?
Yeah, shoot. I mean, well, there's a lot. I mean, like I said, I've touched on it already. Like I'm really fascinated by this training being functional. I don't mean functional in terms of like movement patterns. I mean the return on investment of your training. How efficient is your training and the return on that training exposure and that insult? Because the non-functional overreaching and the moving into the domain of sympathetic overtraining is something I think we're really exposed to here in this community, and it's usually pulling the horses back. Like these again, this fight or flight warrior mentality is, regardless of how I feel, I'm going to run through this brick wall because I'm a fighter. That's not the same for all sports, I know, and some are different, but certainly in the world I'm living in right now, it's like, okay, how do we manage that desire to fight, to continue to go, to redline, the session and make sure that I win the session because it's a fight. So I'm really intrigued on kind of minimal dose effects, and what is the it's like the Goldilocks effect. What's the too much or too little, or that's just right. That's a really unique kind of paradigm which I think we're faced with on a day-to-day basis here, and I call it training ROI, like how are we maximizing our ROI, minimizing the exposure for maximum returns. It's a bit of a different trippy mindset for a strength coach who wants to own the process, and we're all about like more training and more dedication to but there is a Goldilocks effect to that, and that's kind of what I'm interested in right now.
I think that's awesome. Really, really good stuff. Hey, I know this has gone long, and I appreciate you
Oh, no,
taking the time. Folks can find you on Instagram. It's at dr_Duncan_French. Hey, man, I appreciate you taking the time. It was good to catch up and hear what you're up to. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners did too.
For sure, man. Good to reconnect, and congrats on everything you've got going on as well. It's really good to see from afar.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Hopefully we meet up in person here soon.
All right, buddy.